Es un curso centrado en el análisis de las desigualdades, como sabéis quienes habéis estado aquí toda la semana. Es un curso en donde hemos tratado de entender y de analizar la evolución, el papel, la situación de nuestra sociedad y del conjunto de las sociedades europeas en los últimos años en el contexto de unas crecientes desigualdades. Hemos tratado de entender qué son y de dónde vienen, analizar sus factores, ver lo poliédrico del fenómeno y ver cómo afectan no solo desde el mercado de trabajo, sino también y especialmente a las mujeres, a otros sectores sociales, y tratar de entender también el papel macroeconómico y el efecto que tienen sobre el crecimiento, sobre la creación de empleo. Ayer vimos, además, algunas políticas que desde las instituciones se están desarrollando ya para paliar las crecientes desigualdades en nuestro país, pero hoy queríamos cerrar el curso con una reflexión quizá un poquito más, que levantase la mirada un poquito más. Y para eso yo creo que tenemos yo diría que una mesa de lujo, ¿no? Tenemos una mesa de lujo con la presencia de Carlos Andradas, del rector de la Universidad Complutense, con la presencia de Owen Jones, que hablará sobre las desigualdades y el poder, en un contexto europeo además donde creo que da mucho juego precisamente ese título y esta conferencia. Y también nos acompañará para la clausura la alcaldesa de Madrid, Manuela Carmena. Por lo tanto, yo no quiero extenderme más, simplemente agradecer a todos los participantes, a los ponentes, su amabilidad por venir a cerrar un curso del que nosotros estamos muy satisfechos. Pensamos que ha resultado bastante útil, que ha funcionado bastante bien para entender las desigualdades, pero también para entender aquellos mecanismos, aquellas políticas y aquellas estrategias que se pueden desarrollar para reducir, paliar y combatir un fenómeno que a todas luces parece muy negativo para nuestra sociedad. Sin más, le doy la palabra a Carlos Andradas y después hablará Owen Jones. Gracias.
Buenos días, gracias Nacho, buenos días José Manuel, buenos días Fernando y buenos días a todas y a todos. Y yo sí que voy a ser brevísimo porque yo hoy he venido aquí a escuchar. He visto que teníamos un conferenciante de lujo. He visto que teníamos un conferenciante de lujo y en un tema que, como ha dicho Nacho, a mí me parece que es absolutamente importante, ¿no? Que si hay algo que caracteriza estos tiempos es la creciente desigualdad. Yo lo digo siempre que puedo y tengo ocasión de hablar en público, y hoy entonces he venido, como decía, no como rector sino como alumno. Lo único que, como uno no puede dejar de ser rector, me han sentado aquí, pero yo me callo y vengo a escuchar y a daros los buenos días.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Owen, cuando quieras.
Well, thank you. It's an honour to be back here. It's an honour to be on a platform with you again. And it's an honour to be at this conference. These issues, these challenges we face, obviously we can't overcome them one country at a time. We can only do them by working across borders. So it's in that spirit that I'm here. I feel in the last few months I've practically moved to this country. I was just here about 2 weeks ago. And of course, back in December, for example, where I shared a platform with you. These are such calm, tranquil times in which we live, so uneventful. It is, a fraught time for Europe, and it's certainly a fraught time for my country. My country at the moment is experiencing its worst crisis since 1945. A crisis now on a whole number of levels, economically, politically, socially, the rise of xenophobia and racism, the impending breakup of the country. It's a difficult time, to say the least, an ascendant triumphalist political right. But actually the referendum and its result, you have to understand it through the prism of inequality. Because the only group in Britain who voted to remain were middle-class professionals. The majority voted to remain, whilst working-class communities overall, the majority voted to leave the European Union. Now, it wasn't so much a vote on the European Union, it was a vote about immigration, and the problems that many working-class people face, including in the community where I grew up, where people voted to leave the European Union, in northern England, near Manchester, people see a lack of affordable housing, a lack of secure jobs, stagnating or falling living standards, public services under pressure, often through the prism of immigration. This is often in the communities with the least immigration. Manchester, London, they all voted to stay in the European Union, and they're the places with the most immigrants. So it's a quite complex phenomenon. But for me, it was partly an anger that working class people feel at their situation, even though I believe that anger has gone in the wrong direction, the wrong targets, if you like. That anger is being directed against them, immigrants, rather than those at the top. And that's a failing of people like me. It's a failing of the left in terms of coming up with a narrative that explains the problems and inequalities people feel in terms of a society run in the interests of a tiny elite, where the market goes before the needs of people and their aspirations. But at the same time as well, it was a sense working class people have in Britain that they are treated with contempt, they are reviled, they are ignored, they are marginalised, and all of this is of course true. And partly this was a protest against this. It was, sticking one finger up at the people at the top, even if I'm not very happy about how that protest happened. Finally, a working class rebellion against the political elite, and here I am complaining about it. Well, there we are. Now, in terms of just to describe the inequality in Britain, because obviously inequality in Britain and Spain, it doesn't just scar our society, it defines our society. It defines the very structures of the countries in which we live. Now, in Britain, in the last few years, the wealth of the richest 1,000 people has more than doubled during one of the great economic traumas in the modern history of Britain, whilst at the same time, the wages of working people has fallen for the longest period since Queen Victoria sat on the throne back in the 19th century. Hundreds of thousands of workers have been driven into poverty pay or low incomes. Most people in Britain in poverty are in work. They get up in the morning and they earn their poverty, if you like, through their hard work. Most, disproportionately those driven into poverty or low income have been women, which is probably not surprising. Women have disproportionately borne the brunt of this economic crisis, whether it be through job cuts, falling living standards, or the attack on public services and on social security. Now, in terms of just examples of the inequality which defines British society, it's a country where we have, I was going to say the fifth richest economy. Now the pound has fallen so much, it's now the sixth biggest economy on earth. So it's now fallen below France in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum. But nonetheless, it's one of the richest countries that has ever existed, and 1 million people last year were driven to food banks, to charities, in order to satisfy the most basic human need of all, other than breathing and drinking, to eat. 300,000 of them children. In one of the richest countries on the face of the earth, hundreds of thousands of people are now unable to eat. Where we have 1 million families dependent on what we call legal loan sharks, or companies that offer extortionate loans with extortionate interests, because they're so, there's such a precarious financial situation. It's a society in which millions of people now are on these lists for social housing. They're unable to get public housing, affordable public housing, because of the failure to build that housing. Where in London, where I live, which is a wealthy, booming city, where you get these new luxury flats built in the centre of London. And if you cycle past them, you can see all the windows are dark because no one lives there. Snapped up by Russian oligarchs as an investment. Whilst 1 in 4 children in London, a great booming global city, or at least it was, 1 in 4 children in that city grow up in an overcrowded home. And we know the damage that overcrowding does to people when they grow up, in terms of damaging health, education, well-being, more likely to suffer everything from anxiety to asthma as a consequence. Where, because of home ownership, which is in decline in Britain, particularly amongst younger people where it's in a state of collapse, and because public housing isn't built, people in Britain are forced into the private rented sector, where rents are very high and rising far beyond people's living standards, whilst their wages, of course, have been stagnating or falling. And in Britain, the private rented sector is very, very badly regulated indeed. You can be evicted with 2 months' notice. Now, because the number of families in the private rented sector has more than doubled in the last few years, that means it's very difficult to set down roots. It's very disruptive to the childhood of young people, to people's growing up as children, because they're shifted from school to school, they're unable to have security and stability in a community because they have to move so much. And because of cuts to social security in Britain, in places like London in particular, poorer people are driven out from inner London out into outer London instead. It's becoming more like Paris, the so-called donut kind of effect in Paris, where you get the banlieue around the edges, where poorer people are concentrated, whilst the centre becomes a playground almost for the wealthy. And that's increasingly, of course, happening in London. Now, I could go on with in terms of younger people here have suffered even more greatly, of course, than in Britain. Half of young people or so out of work in this country. Now, it's not so bad in Britain to that degree, though unemployment is obviously too high. We know that the impact of being unemployed at a young age has a scarring effect, as it's described, where not only do younger people suffer from mental distress, or more likely to as a consequence, but also more likely to be unemployed and have lower wages for the rest of their working lives as a consequence. In Britain, as well as here, we have the phenomenon of 0-hour contracts, no set hours in contracts. And it's like a return to a supposedly bygone era, where dock workers, they used to march to the dockyard and they used to put their hands up hoping to get work, often to go home disappointed. Well, now I meet young people who get text messages. It's 6 o'clock in the morning telling them if they've got any hours that day. These are people who don't have pensions. They don't have paid sick leave. They forget, of course, about paid maternity leave. Rights that other workers previously took for granted, which have been stripped away increasingly. Now, younger people are punished for aspiring to an education because they're saddled with debt as a consequence. Their living standards have disproportionately fallen, even compared to the rest of the population. They're the ones who struggle most to get affordable housing, and even if they're saddled with debt by going through education, they often end up doing the sorts of jobs they would have got in any case. Now, in terms of those inequalities, that's one of the various examples of inequality that scar British society, which are also obviously very, I'm sure, reminiscent here in Spain. I know they are. But it's also the sense of one rule for those at the top of society and one rule for everybody else. Now, the issue of tax avoidance comes into this very strongly, because I presume most of you aren't paying 0% tax, unless I've misjudged my audience. You're not a multinational global corporation who can, or wealthy individuals who can stash your fortune in Panama. And what we have, for example, in Britain, it's an incredible, because if you think about a small business compared to a big business, in Britain, and Spain or wherever, if you're a small coffee shop or a local bookshop and you don't get your tax right, the tax authorities will come knocking on your door quite quickly. But, you can't use these rules, these ruses, these loopholes. You can't charge yourself for using your own logo and then offset it against tax. You can't route your sales through another country with lower taxes. You can't take losses from foreign entities and put it onto your balance sheet in your own country to make it look like you're not making any money, so you shouldn't pay any tax. You just have to pay your tax. And what happens in Britain is you get accountancy firms, large accountancy firms, who facilitate tax avoidance on an industrial scale. They're seconded, they're sent to government to help draw up the tax laws. Then they go off and they tell their clients, their big business and wealthy clients, how to avoid the very laws they themselves have helped to design in the first place. I mean, can you imagine unemployed people sent to, the Department of Social Security to draw up legislation on social security? Of course that doesn't happen. But that's the situation you have in places like Britain, where laws on tax are literally drawn up by tax avoiders themselves. Another example of one rule for some and one rule for everybody else. In Britain, as everywhere else, the banks plunged us into an economic disaster from which we have yet to recover. We're now mostly through a lost decade as a consequence. And those banks weren't bailed out by free market dogma. They were bailed out by the state. They became the most generously supported social security claimant that exists in any society. But with two key differences from others who receive social security. Firstly, the amount of money they receive, not a tiny amount, not a pathetic, paltry amount that others are forced to live on, but instead hundreds of billions of pounds. But critically, very few conditions attached to that support. So in Britain, the bankers paid more bonuses than every European Union country put together, with the government trying to take the European Union to court to try and stop any limits put on those bonuses. Where those banks don't lend to small businesses properly, helping to choke off economic recovery from a disaster that they themselves caused. So all that public money with very few conditions attached. But compare and contrast to people at the bottom of society, people often thrown out of work precisely because of the behaviour of those people at the top. Now, I'll give you an example, a concrete example. There's a 60-year-old man called Stephen Taylor from Manchester, near where I'm from. Now, Stephen Taylor is an army veteran, and he was unemployed, and if you're unemployed at the age of 60, it's really hard and difficult to get another job. But he tried his best. And in the meantime, he was volunteering for a charity, the Royal Legion, to raise money for maimed and injured former comrades of his. And he was selling poppies as what people wear in order to remember the war dead, to raise money for maimed and injured former comrades of his. And he was selling them in a supermarket where he applied for work unsuccessfully. Now, he had his social security stopped for 4 weeks on the basis that his volunteering for that charity showed he wasn't trying hard enough to look for work. Now, hundreds of thousands of people have had their social security stopped as a punishment, and that's just one example. Compare and contrast. For those at the top of society, the support they get unlimited, practically, very few conditions attached. For those at the bottom of society, a pathetic amount of support, but ever more conditional or simply stripped away altogether. That the state will come rushing to the rescue of those with wealth and power, but for those at the bottom of society, they're expected to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, even if, to quote Barack Obama, they don't even have any boots. And that's socialism for the rich, and it's capitalism for everybody else. Sink or swim. Abide by the rules of the market unless you're so powerful that state largesse will come to your support. And I think that's a critical point in terms of in British society and everywhere else. Now, the problem we've had, of course, in Britain, as we've seen in the referendum, is a cynical, relentless attempt to redirect people's justifiable anger away from those with power to people's neighbours. And people are encouraged, low-paid workers, not to be angry with their employers for not paying them properly, not to be angry with the government for cutting their social security, but instead to be jealous of the unemployed person down the road living in a life of luxury with widescreen television sets. They always go on about widescreen television sets. It's a mystery. You can't buy any other form of television anymore. Private sector workers, their pensions decimated, one of the great scandals of our time, and they're told not to be angry with their bosses, but instead to be jealous of the public sector worker, the nurse, the teacher. Why should they still have their pension intact when you don't? A race to the bottom rather than raising everybody up. People who can't get affordable homes because governments won't build them. People who can't get a secure job because they've been ripped from the economy. They're told not to be angry with the powerful, but to be jealous of the immigrant getting the job or the home that should be yours instead. People are told effectively not to be angry that they've been robbed, but instead to be angry that their less deserving neighbour hasn't been robbed quite as much as they have. It's the politics of divide and rule. When people are angry with each other, of course they're not angry with those at the top. Now, in terms of how we ended up in the situation in which we currently live, it's a long one, but various things, again, specific partly to Britain, but very common to other countries. In Britain, we saw, of course, the rise of the new right in the 1970s. Now, and their intellectual confidence. Now, those people now call the neoliberals or supporters of market dogma, whatever. They, in the aftermath of World War II, they were on the fringes of intellectual and political debate. They were seen as defeated by the experience of the Great Depression and World War II. Now, and they were very despondent, you know. People like Milton Friedman, Hayek, they all felt they'd been defeated by history. But Milton Friedman said that the way you get change is through a crisis. But he said it depends on the ideas lying around. And what is politically impossible can then become politically inevitable. That crisis came in the 1970s with the collapse of the post-war consensus, the oil shock, the collapse of the Bretton Woods international financial framework, and a crisis that swept the Western world. And that was the crisis that was, for the new right, like Thatcherism, used very ably against particularly a divided opposition, and that's what they did. In Britain, the defeats of the trade unions was critical because they were the backbone of the left. In terms of rising inequality, of course, it's inextricably linked to what's happened to our trade union movement because their inability to defend people's living standards and be a check on the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of employers is one of the main reasons inequality has grown so much between workers and employers. The destruction of industry in Britain, skilled, secure jobs. These were often male-dominated jobs, of course. They were often dirty and unhealthy jobs, but they were replaced not by other skilled, secure jobs, but often by very low-paid, very insecure service sector jobs. So, for example, now as many people in Britain work in call centres as worked down the mines at the peak of the mining industry. Retail is one of the biggest employers. And so we have this so-called hourglass economy now, where you have middle-class professional jobs at the top, lots of low-paid, low-skilled jobs at the bottom, and then a lack of middle-income secure jobs. So that was also critical, of course. As well as that, of course, we had the huge cuts in taxes for those at the top, whether it be corporation tax or income tax. The mass privatisation that took place, handing public assets to a increasingly, these private monopolies as they've increasingly become in Britain. Whether it be the form of globalisation we've had, which makes it very easy for wealthy individuals to shift money around very quickly and also put constraints on government policies. So all of these have been absolutely critical. Now, when we talk in terms of Britain and elsewhere about those at the top who've benefited, of course, it's not like, when I talk about the establishment or whatever you want to call it, like Castor, it's not like it's a conspiracy where people are sitting in closed doors with, big cigars and laughing at devious plans to, rub the faces of the poor in the dirt. It doesn't work like that. They're bound together by common shared economic interests and also a common shared ideology, which many of us call neoliberalism, though that's not a very accessible word to use in public. but it's a shared ideology, a shared outlook of the world that binds them very closely together. Now, one of the things that binds them together, which I know you talk about a lot in Spain, is a revolving door of power. So, for example, in Britain, you get politicians who work as they're the minister in charge of the National Health Service. Then they end up, of course, working for private healthcare firms who seek to benefit from the privatisation of the public healthcare firm, exploiting their contacts, their experience, and all the rest. It's the same if you're a defence minister. You end up working for defence companies, again benefiting from all those contacts. That revolving door as well helps bring and cements power together. In Britain, many members of Parliament have second jobs working for firms which benefit, of course, from the policies that they themselves vote for and advocate. And again, that's a very, I think, absolutely critical point. Another point, of course, which is pointless pretending, ignoring, is the role of the media, of the press, which is, we talk often about a free press. In the sense the government doesn't control the press, that's true. We're not North Korea, not a very ambitious place to start, admittedly. And I don't want to be flippant there, because journalists are, in other countries, are tortured and killed and persecuted. But nonetheless, when you have a press which is run by a very small group of media moguls, very rich individuals, who are part of a status quo that it's in their interest to defend, then, of course, you end up with a press which, doesn't, if you like, challenge the interests of the powerful, but it determines, if you like, it decides what is acceptable political debate and what isn't. They police the terms of debate in any given country. And they do that in such a way which is most favourable for those with power. So that means shutting down any discussion which gives a platform, if you like, to those who oppose the way things are. Now, of course, you have that, aggressively in this country. Movements and parties which oppose the status quo are demonised and hated by a press which is run very much in the interests of a tiny elite. And that's pointless pretending otherwise. Though in Britain, sometimes, I suppose my view about this is we think, as though people are just brainwashed by the press and they're just robots and sheep. And yes, of course, the press distort people's perceptions of reality. In Britain, for example, people think there are far more immigrants than there are, that social security fraud is far higher than it is, that there are 20 times more teenage pregnancies than there are, and that's because people are misinformed. But nonetheless, if we just think, the press will just brainwash people, we might as well just give up. Only by building a movement with an inspiring alternative can we hope to challenge this. Just finally, because I know we're going to have a discussion, I do think it's important that we also, when we talk about power, we talk about how inequalities of class intersect with gender and with race, because all too often the left has had a bad record of doing that. There's been often the sense of reducing everything purely to class, and we can't understand class without gender, and we can't understand class without race, and that applies for all three together. So when we talk about inequality in terms of the workforce, well, who does the lowest paid and most insecure work? Of course, it's women who, as I've said, have disproportionately suffered. When we talk about cuts to public services, for example, in Britain, hostels for women fleeing domestic violence have been slashed in a country where 1.4 million women face domestic violence every single year. It's the same with race, of course, whether it be the fact that if young black men are far more likely to be unemployed. In fact, at the peak of the economic crisis, over half of young black men were unemployed, whether it's the harassment they also face from the police, for example. These are all issues we have to talk about, how they intersect. Again, in terms of power, in Britain, 78% of MPs are men. That well-known bastion of feminism, Sudan, has more women in its parliament than Britain does. And that's the same with all the powerful institutions. They're very much dominated by men. And again, we have to look at that and how it all intersects. And one of the things which I think has been so inspiring about Spain is the role of women in the new movements challenging inequality, like Ada Colau and, of course, like the fantastic Manuela Carmina. And I think that is an example to all of us, that movements against inequality for a long time have been dominated by men, and it shows in terms of the agendas that we've seen. But just finally on that, what we have to do in terms of the challenges we face overcoming these inequalities, it is firstly that sense of, particularly in places like Britain, but elsewhere, because, people's anger at their situation is going in two different directions. It's going in the direction of a populist xenophobic right, and it's going to movements of the left, new movements of the left. So on the one hand, it's Donald Trump, it's the National Front in France, it's the Austrian far right, it's the neo-Nazi Golden Dawn, it's UKIP in Britain. On the other hand, it's Bernie Sanders, it's Podemos, it's the Austrian Greens, it's Syriza, it's Corbyn. So it's important to realise, it is going in these two different directions, and that should worry us, because if there's another economic crisis, the xenophobic anti-immigrant right is very well prepared to exploit people's anger and frustration over inequality. So we have to get our act together. And that means challenging, obviously, the fact that people's anger is directed at the wrong targets. But it's also resignation. People have this sense that injustice is like the weather, that you can complain about it raining, nothing you can do about it. It's just a fact of life. I remember posting on social media about the Panama files when they were published. And I made a point, this is a wealthy elite who advocate or implement cuts but on the basis they don't have enough money, whilst they're putting their wealth in tax havens abroad to avoid paying tax. And the response I got wasn't anger. It was, well, duh, what do you expect? Obviously, you'll tell me the Pope's Catholic next. And that worried me, that frightened me. Because what it showed was a sense of resignation at injustice. People would have been more surprised if rich people didn't avoid tax. That would have been the real shocker for them. And that's poisonous. It's a poisonous attitude, because it means people shrug their shoulders. Yeah, they might yell at the television occasionally, but they just think this is just a fact of life. It rains on holidays and rich people avoid tax, and that's just the way the world is. And we have to overcome that. And that's why the sorts of movements you've developed in Spain are so important. Yes, this is a difficult time politically in Spain as well as Britain, though, the problems in Britain are, I think, particularly profound at the moment, politically in any case. But they are, in terms of galvanising people, building bottom-up grassroots movements and political parties that can build broad coalitions. That's the only way we'll solve this. And we won't solve it, as I've said, one country at a time. We can only do this by uniting across Europe. The problems we face, the specifics aren't, it's not the same. They differ in specific and scale, they differ in what they are and all the rest. But we have many of the same injustices in common, and we're fighting the same people. And we won't overcome these problems unless we unite together across borders, overcoming language barriers or cultural barriers, or, the fact we don't live in the same place. And it's easier now to build that solidarity than it's ever been. So that's what we have to do. It's not easy, but change doesn't happen by waiting for the goodwill and generosity of the powerful. It only comes by people organising from below. The struggle and sacrifice of our ancestors is what won us the rights and freedoms we have today, which are now under attack. And we owe it to our ancestors to defend the rights and freedoms they have and fight for a different sort of society run in the interests of the majority. But it's incumbent on all of us to do that, not just in our own countries, but to unite across borders. And if we do that, then I have absolutely no question, despite how difficult and bleak things are, and things have looked bleak for Europe in the past, but we overcame those problems and those dangers and those threats, and we can do it again. So we should, despite our fears and our worries about the future, we should have confidence and optimism that as our ancestors overcame injustice, we too can do the same. Thank you.
Thank you. Si os parece, abrimos un turno de preguntas, palabras, opiniones.
Well, thank you a lot for the talk. I would like to know if you think that establishment in Britain will allow for the Brexit.
I think Britain now is in an impossible situation because either Brexit happens with huge economic turmoil, or Brexit doesn't happen and there'll be such political disorder, such a rebellion, that it would also cause chaos for the country. So there's not a great route through it. I mean, in terms of, the establishment was divided on Brexit. Much of the media, Rupert Murdoch and the rest, they backed Brexit. So did various, businesses. The city opposed it because they are now going to suffer the consequences. So the financial sector, in particular, which has been very dominant in Britain, politically as well as economically, they're the ones who are most aggressively against it. And obviously now the debate rests on Article 50, which will, as soon as that is activated, then it becomes an irreversible process of Brexit. Now, at the moment, people keep pushing back that deadline. When will it ever happen? When it keeps being kicked down the road, and there are some people who think it will never happen. And I suppose I find it difficult to see how Brexit would be avoided, because the problems Britain will now face, yes, will be economic turmoil, which we're already seeing, as I can see from the value of the pound travelling here. Whether it be, 750,000 jobs have disappeared. Sorry, they've not been advertised. They've been taken away from being advertised since the vote happened. We've seen, we're now predicted to go into recession. Whether it be the political establishment is in turmoil, Scotland's likely to leave, but as well critically, EU diplomats privately make this point, that they won't treat Britain, it's not vengeance, but it's survival. Because Britain now has set a precedent of being the first EU member state to leave, and it's a major EU member state to leave. They are going to suffer the economic aftershocks of Brexit, which will make their own voters angry. Many voters, including in Spain, regard Britain as having already had a special deal and special treatment, so they're already resentful of that. And also, there are anti-immigrant and anti-EU parties across Europe that they fear will now be bolstered by Britain leaving. So they have to treat Britain badly out of that sense of survival. That's their position. So that also complicates things. So a section of the establishment is in panic about the whole thing. They think Britain now is in irreversible decline economically, politically, globally as a consequence. And you can see why they think that. It's quite overwhelming evidence to think that. But to be honest, we've had a referendum where 52% of people voted. And unless it's so bad, the consequences now, that people, and we've already got buyer's remorse. Yes, according to the polls, enough people who voted leave regret it, that if the referendum was held today, Britain would not vote to leave. But it would need so much buyer's remorse, such an economic and political disaster for Brexit to be avoided, because people would have changed their minds. Otherwise, I just think there'd be riots on the streets. I mean, the fact is Britain has, the main reason people voted to leave the European Union was freedom of movement because of immigration. But now if Britain joins the free trade area, they have to accept freedom of movement and they have to pay into it. If they don't do that, the economy is going to be absolutely screwed. All for a few less Polish builders. But there you have it. So I don't know is the answer. It's two impossible situations. One economically is very, very bad. The other politically is impossible, because I genuinely think it would trigger some sort of revolution if there was an attempt to stop it. I suspect what we'll see is it will be delayed for a very long time. The can will be kicked down the road for a long, long time. The negotiations will go on for years and years and years. There'll be massive uncertainty, and we won't know. So I'd say 50-50. I don't know. But 60-40. I think it's more likely to be Brexit, but I can see why you'd say it might not happen at all.
Buenos días, gracias por la intervención. Constatamos que en España y en Inglaterra en todos lados andamos igual, de mal. Me preocupan las alternativas. Preguntaría por algunas líneas en el tema del empleo, en el tema de puestos laborales, puesto que no parece fácil con el actual modelo productivo que se generen nuevos puestos de trabajo en una economía que se está basando seguramente en otros parámetros, ¿no? No sé en qué líneas se podría, en este mismo seminario se han debatido ya algunos de estos temas, vería usted. Y la otra cuestión que me preocupa mucho es que para un cambio de modelo productivo seguramente necesitamos una financiación externa, una financiación internacional importante, y dado la liquidez, dado la dificultad de captar ese dinero internacional que fluye no se sabe ni por dónde, ¿cómo podemos hacerlo? O si nos tenemos que restringir a un modelo alternativo, a ir muy despacito solamente con autofinanciación, cosa que evidentemente nos llevaría a... No sé si la gente estaría dispuesta a seguir un camino lento de transformación del modelo productivo. Son la financiación con el modelo productivo por un lado y por otro lado la cuestión laboral, es decir, que se desprende de ella, es decir, en qué áreas o en qué líneas se puede aumentar el empleo y mitigar la desigualdad.
Well, good morning. Thanks for your question. If I understand the question correctly, firstly, I think in terms of, I don't like Germany's policies in terms of to the rest of the European Union, but what they've done within their own borders, within their own country, is have a state-led industrial strategy. What's happened in Britain is we've allowed industries to be destroyed, decimated, on the basis that, the official ideology, both of Conservatives and New Labour, is let the market decide. The state doesn't choose winners or losers. That's up to the market to do that instead. So much so, actually, that Britain within the European Union, when there was there was planned action to stop China steel dumping on global markets, which was obviously intended to destroy the steel industry in places like Britain vetoed it. So, but we've allowed successively the exception was the financial sector. The state did intervene to support that, but whether it be the mining sector, whether it be steel or the rest, Britain has allowed those industries to go to rot, and many other countries have done the same. But Germany hasn't done that. They've had an active industrial strategy, particularly promoting first the high-tech sector, but also renewable energy. And they've created hundreds of thousands of jobs in renewable energy by having a state-led industrial strategy. And what that's done is it takes on the environmental crisis, but it also creates good, skilled, secure jobs for young people backed up with apprenticeships. The youth unemployment rate in Germany is very low compared to the rest of Europe. And I think that state-led industrial strategy is a model that all of us should be applying across Europe. But the second point is, I think there's an interesting debate going on now about, because of technology, it used to be the case that technology would create more jobs than it destroyed. Inevitably, new technologies would destroy other jobs, but then more jobs would be created by it. So the personal computer, its advent, obviously meant the end of some jobs, but it created lots and lots of other jobs in its place. Well, the argument now, the debate that's now being had, is actually technology could end up destroying more jobs than it's creating. In Britain, it was one report was suggesting 11 million jobs could be destroyed as a consequence of new technologies. But the point that the study made was this wasn't going to be the low-skill jobs, as was the case in the past, but middle-class professional jobs would also be destroyed as well. And I think that's why the debate increasingly needs to go onto citizens' income. Because inevitably now, people's working lives across Europe has become more and more precarious, and that's not a temporary thing, that will be a permanent feature. And whether it be, you've seen the rise of self-employed people. In Britain, it's predicted there will be more self-employed people than public sector workers in the next 2 or 3 years. the newly self-employed people are often people with very low income, or and they struggle to get any work. They don't get paid, social security or anything else. Their lives are very, very, very insecure and difficult in many cases. And we also see the rise of temporary workers, zero-hour contract workers, people trapped in a cycle of work, unemployment. And having a citizen's income, so everybody has a right of citizenship, has a basic income, which they can depend on, I think has to be the future. Now, there's trials going on in places like Canada, and I think pragmatically we just have to accept that. And I think it's a good thing. I mean, is it good our lives are so defined by work in the way they are? If we can have, through technology, we can still create the same wealth, and people can have a better work-life balance, that's a good thing. John Maynard Keynes in 1930 predicted that by now we would be working a 14-hour week. That hasn't quite panned out as he expected. But I do think, because, yes, we do need an industrial strategy to create the jobs of the future, but pragmatically, there is going to be less work around, and either we just consign a large chunk of the population to insecurity and demonise them for their own situation, or we have a citizen's income that replaces other forms of social security, takes away the stigma and gives people security in the new era in which we live. And I think what's interesting, it's not just the left arguing that, but people on the right, and actually people like Milton Friedman were amongst those who supported some sorts of citizen's income. So we could have consensus on that, and I think that's partly the way forward.
Bueno, yo trabajo en formación continua en la Fundación Tripartita. Y bueno, supongo que sabrás, o bueno, mejor dicho, supongo que no sabrás que en España existe un modelo de financiación de recaudación para formación, que es a través de la cuota de formación profesional, tanto de los salarios de los trabajadores como de las empresas, y es un 0,7%, es muy poco lo que se recauda, pero este porcentaje va a un fondo para luego destinarlo a formación tanto de trabajadores como desempleados. Entonces yo quería saber si en Gran Bretaña existe algún modelo así parecido, o cuál es el modelo de, si tenéis algo así parecido. Y por otro lado, pues que me des tu opinión sobre qué te parece la formación, ¿no?, como alternativa para cubrir las desigualdades entre las personas. O sea, bueno, pues ¿cómo lo ves tú? Si te parece importante o qué es lo que tú piensas. Muchas gracias.
Well, thank you for that. Thanks for the question. I mean, I don't know the precise details, obviously, of the model here in Spain. So I can't go into detail, obviously, about the Spanish model. But in Britain, I mean, firstly, there's a lack of apprenticeships. That's one of the problems we face. But to be honest, there aren't the industries to support the apprenticeships anyway. Because we've got such a low-skill economy, and it's increasingly been de-skilled, skills have been taken away. So actually often you get people who are over-skilled for their jobs, they're over-qualified for the jobs that they're doing. So the problem we've got actually is we're training people up to do jobs that don't actually exist. So you get university graduates who end up working in supermarkets, stacking shelves. And there's been lots of cases of people, for example, unless they do a degree, unless they take... there's one example of this woman. She was training she'd done a science degree, and she was doing work experience in a museum, and that was for her relevant training. But she was told, no, you've got to take a job in a supermarket, and if you don't, we'll take away your social security, and that's what happened. Now, I mean, it's just perverse, in my opinion. So we don't have the proper training in apprenticeships. We had basically work experience for people over 25 that they then called apprenticeships. They just changed the name. But for younger people, the problem is just the lack of skilled work just isn't there, because we destroyed the skilled industries we used to have, and we replaced them with a low-skill service sector economy. The problem isn't that people aren't being trained up enough. There just isn't the skilled work there available. And that's the big crisis. I'd like a German model where we do have apprenticeships, but you need the industries there to support them, and we don't have that. So yeah, as I say, I don't know the model here in Spain, but I know the problem with the model in Britain is skilled work is being destroyed, and often people are forced to do work which is completely unsuitable given their qualifications. So I know that hasn't answered it properly, but yeah, it's a mess.
The first one would be, I've heard that, or everyone has read that half of the youngsters were in Britain were against, or like half of the youngsters who voted were against leaving.
75%. No, 75%.
Okay, 75% of the youngsters who voted, but then I heard that only 30% voted of the young. So here, as you have seen, if you have said that in Spain we have new movements on the left and also on the right. We have to say that Ciudadanos is also like a younger movement in the politics. So where are they in Britain? So that's number one. And number two, in your last book, you wrote about the very smart movement of the right to shift the window of acceptance, even in small steps to the right. So what has been radical a couple of decades ago, appears to be normal now. So how can we shift back that window of acceptance or normality to the left where we would like to see it? Thanks.
Thanks for that. Well, firstly, the point about young people and politics is very interesting, because across the Western world, the new movements, progressive movements, are being driven by younger people. Bernie Sanders in the United States, this unlikely septuagenarian icon of younger people. In some of the primaries, 85% of people under 30 were voting for him, Bernie Sanders. Both young men and young women, I think it's an important point. In Spain, obviously, Podemos has a big lead amongst younger people. Similarly, Jeremy Corbyn, polling is very clear that younger people were far more supportive. The Green Party in Britain, in the last election, ran on an anti-austerity left platform, and again, younger people were the ones who... Is it not working? Oh, anyway, yeah, younger people. But what I think is interesting about this point is there is this view sometimes which is younger people are left-wing when they're young because they're naive, and as they get older they get more right-wing. But the evidence doesn't bear that out, because in 1983 in Britain, Labour were defeated heavily by Margaret Thatcher, and Margaret Thatcher had a big lead amongst people under the age of 25, which people might, find a bit odd now. At the last general election in Britain, Labour had a 16-point lead amongst people under the age of 25. And, those younger voters were twice as likely to vote for the Greens. The same in the United States. Younger people in the 1980s voted for Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. Their children now are often the ones supporting Sanders, but it's not the case that their parents were left-wing in their youth and then became more right-wing. So I think, it does show that there is a generational shift going on. It's not always in a good way, actually, because in Austria, many young working class people voted for the far right, particularly in smaller towns. And that's in Poland, places like that. Younger people are definitely voting for the hard right. But in places like Spain, Britain, the United States, that's true. My only concern is that, you're right about Brexit. In Britain, 18 to 25-year-olds, about 70 to 75% voted to remain. Amongst those over 65, it was an overwhelming majority to leave. And all I would say is that I worry at the moment about generational conflict, the language of generational conflict, because if we indulge it, we're going to lose. If we allow this, we're young versus old, because all that will do is cement. It will just cement the position of the right amongst older people. If older people end up being demonised, if you like, which I think I can see happening. I've seen that in the aftermath of the Spanish elections, anger at older people. I've seen that in Britain, very much so. In the aftermath of Brexit, people are very angry and upset. there's a poll done of younger people, and half of them said they'd cried over the result. So people are very angry and upset and traumatised in some cases. But the lesson is, firstly, there's a problem with turnout. As I've said, at the last general election, young people overwhelmingly voted for left of centre parties, but only 42% of them voted. Amongst people over the age of 65, people overwhelmingly voted Conservative, but nearly 80% of them voted, nearly twice the proportion. So obviously, on the one hand, we desperately need to organise younger people. Many of them feel that politics is irrelevant to their lives. It's not communicated in a way they understand. It's full of people they're not sympathetic towards. Politics is just something that occasionally comes into their life to attack them. It's not a positive thing at all, and many feel just cynical about it altogether. And that cynicism needs to be overcome. But also, we've got to do far more to appeal to older people as progressive movements. So rather than demonising older people, we need to blame ourselves for our failure to win enough support from older people. We need to talk about things like poverty amongst pensioners and what we're going to do about it. We need to talk about the lack of social care. People work all their lives and then often don't get the care they need throughout their final, their older years. So that for me is an existential crisis. Unless we start winning over older people, we are never going to win. It's not enough to say, let's wait for 20 years and people will die. It's a very macabre way of looking at things. We need to think now how we win over older people as well as mobilising more young people. And the point you make about the Overton window is a right-wing concept from the United States, named after this right-winger called Philip Overton, I think Philip. Anyway, the idea that everything within the window is what is seen as mainstream, acceptable. That's the way the world is. That's kind of, current accepted wisdom. Everything outside the wisdom is seen as deluded, irrational, extreme, fringe. And the point you made is that window can be shifted. Because in the 1970s, in Britain, if you supported cutting taxes on the rich, privatising public services, destroying the power of trade unions, that would have been seen as an extreme position to have. But now that's entirely mainstream. Similarly, in the 1970s, to believe in state intervention in the economy, high taxes on the rich, strong trade unions, that was just received wisdom amongst both Conservatives and people who supported Labour. So that window is shifted. And part of it is what I said before, that point of the way you get changes through a crisis, but it depends on the ideas lying around. And to be honest, the right they spent decades preparing this intellectual foundations for what they were going to do. It was all there and ready and prepared. The left hasn't done that. Since the 1970s, we've often become very defensive. It's just stop this, stop privatisation, stop cuts, stop the world I want to get off, rather than a inspiring, coherent alternative, particularly at a time of crisis. We live in a time of perpetual crisis. There are lots of opportunities, but we fail to take them. But the other is what the right have. I called them outriders. I don't know if that's going to translate at all. Basically, people who, like think tanks, intellectuals, and movements that push the terms of acceptable debate. So what the right have done with think tanks is they'll go, I don't know, here's an example. Let's cut taxes on the rich to 20%. And then a mainstream right-wing politician will go, no, that's too extreme. We should cut it to 30% instead. And that would be then seen as moderate in comparison. So that helps shift the terms of debate. By them making more radical ideas and constantly promoting them, they give space to others to not go quite as far, but to be seen that's a compromise then. And that's a very clever strategy that the left is just not very good at all. And that means for us, it's not so much, think tanks have a role, intellectuals have a role, but for us it's more about having movements, grassroots movements, because we're not going to get huge funding from big businesses for think tanks and all the rest, but we can build movements that can put ideas on the agenda, and that shifts the terms of debate. And we've done that over tax avoidance. No one was really talking about tax avoidance a few years ago, but movements in Britain, was a movement called UK Uncut that protested about tax avoidance, that forced it on the agenda and shift the terms of debate so that even the right had to talk about it. It's the same with, LGBT equality. if you supported equal marriage 25 years ago, 10 years ago in lots of ways, but 15 years ago, that would have been seen as, what are you, that's an extreme, preposterous thing to suggest. So, we have shifted the Overton window in a progressive direction in some ways, and so it shows it can be done. It's not easy, but we can do it as they've done it.
En algún momento sí que has mencionado la cuestión del feminismo, ¿no? Que muchas veces cuando se hace un análisis del sistema capitalista hay una ausencia clara que tiene que ver con esto. A mí me preocupa bastante porque si analizamos la situación del mercado laboral y en un contexto en el que están desapareciendo las instituciones que de alguna manera sostenían la vida en común y garantizaban unos mínimos de vida, el papel de la mujer y el papel de la familia en concreto en el sostenimiento de esa vida tiene que ser reificado. Es decir, uno de los movimientos acompañados con estos planes de ajuste tendrá que ser el de alguna manera volver a potenciar la familia como ese espacio donde cuidar, atender la vida y que siga produciéndose clase trabajadora necesaria para incorporarse al mercado laboral. Esta cuestión es fundamental y es estructural del sistema capitalista y sin embargo no existe ahora mismo ningún partido de izquierdas ni ningún movimiento social que esté poniendo esto encima de la mesa. Este ciclo de luchas del que estamos saliendo en España y que de alguna manera se cierra en parte con las elecciones del 26 de junio queda un panorama bastante desalentador porque los movimientos feministas se han desestructurado en esta batalla que han dado. En este caso concreto, bueno, hemos tenido que luchar por el derecho a decidir sobre nuestra propia maternidad y nuestro propio cuerpo. Ha habido una serie de hitos que sí que han generado una acumulación de fuerzas, pero que ahora mismo ha desaparecido y no hay ningún espacio político representándolo, ¿no? Mi pregunta sería, en Gran Bretaña, ¿cuál es la situación de los movimientos feministas? Si es que existe alguna posición fuerte al respecto o cómo los partidos políticos están incluyendo o no estas demandas. Y cómo empezar a introducirlas dentro de este tipo de reflexiones, ¿no? Porque no tengo los datos del 26 de junio, pero sí que es verdad que Podemos tiene una brecha muy fuerte entre hombres y mujeres, ¿no? O sea, tienen un discurso que al parecer no termina de enganchar con las necesidades de los movimientos feministas y de las mujeres, y a mí me parece una cuestión central, porque o empezamos a atacar esto y poner esto sobre la mesa, o realmente nuestra situación en términos de agencia política, pero también en términos materiales, va a ser muy complicada en la nueva etapa que viene. No sé cuál es tu reflexión al respecto.
Thanks. So if I understand that, elements of that, so in terms of speaking about the role, for example, of in feminist movements in Britain and what the situation is there, okay. Well, firstly, again, I do think it's critical to just note how inspiring the role of women in progressive movements has been in Spain, particularly the anti-eviction movement. People like Ada Colau, that working class women and women in broader society have been at the forefront of that particular movement, for example. And I suppose in Britain, there was on the old left, there's a kind of, firstly, machismo and sexism and all the rest. And there was almost this idea of first the class struggle, then when we've had a revolution, then we'll deal with women's rights afterwards. It was a very, I heard this leading Trotskyist in Britain, and a woman asked him, under socialism, what will women's liberation be? And he said, that's a very interesting question. Why don't you make me a cup of tea and then we can discuss it afterwards? And, there was this kind of, in Britain, most trade union members are women, but most trade union leaders are men. And there was a very macho culture within trade unionism often as well, despite the fact most are women. And I suppose the issues that, in Britain in terms of the priorities are firstly, of course, male violence against women, and that's become more and more of an issue that the feminist, because there is a resurgent that in the last few years, a new wave of feminism, and whether that be obviously 1.4 million women who face domestic violence, 90,000 women who are raped a year in Britain, or so, 400,000 women who are sexually assaulted, whether it be the objectification of women. So there's been lots of campaigns. For example, the Sun newspaper, the most read newspaper, and people find this astonishing in other countries, every day it would have on page 3 a topless woman. I mean, it's like a family newspaper. It's incredible. And there was a campaign. There was this big campaign against it, which was successful. And it was just about a broader point about how women are objectified, and that's been a key thing that's on the left and the new feminist movements, as well as obviously in terms of that austerity has disproportionately affected women, cuts to social security, cuts to jobs, and so on. And the fact that women are disproportionately the lowest paid and most insecure jobs. But what's been interesting, actually, is we've had movements, not on your scale in Spain, but about the housing crisis in Britain, about people being forced out of their homes to make way for unaffordable homes instead, and dispersed around in their communities, ripped apart. And there was these movements against the housing crisis led by young working class women, some of them teenagers. And this was, I just think a very inspiring development because it shows that actually increasingly women are at the forefront of the struggles that are taking place, even though it's still very male dominated. I still find it tragic. The next Prime Minister in Britain is going to be a woman, a Conservative woman, because there's two candidates. One of them is somewhere to the right of Genghis Khan. There you go. But there's still a problem in terms of on the left in Britain, women are still underrepresented. And I do think there's a problem amongst certain left-wing men that because they call themselves left-wing, they don't think they can be sexist. How can I be sexist? I'm left-wing. They have no kind of criticism, if you like, of the privileges that they have. They have no awareness of it. And so there is a big problem on the left in terms of that. I know that's a bit broad, wide-ranging. But I think the good thing that's happened in Britain is there has been a new feminist movement. There are divisions, by the way. For example, over sex work, for example. There's a big division there on some who want it criminalised, some who want to organise sex workers. Sadly, I think a division over trans rights and trans people. I don't know what the debate here is like. But there's a division between younger feminists who support trans rights and often so-called older radical feminists who don't, and very militantly don't. So there's these big divisions. I mean, I'd be interested to know in Spain whether you're having these debates within the feminist movement, because in Britain they're very, very bitter, and there's a big war going on between those two different forms of feminism.
Hola, enhorabuena por la exposición y por la pasión con la que habla y la claridad de ideas. Yo quería preguntar, entre las posibles alternativas, siempre se habla del poder de la prensa, ¿no? Yo quisiera saber si usted sabe cómo se podría formar una prensa, y cuando digo prensa digo periódico, digo radio, digo televisión, realmente de izquierda, con crowdfunding, con autofinanciación, como fuera, pero es que los medios de comunicación están tomados totalmente por la derecha conservadora.
Very good question. Well, actually, I don't know. I mean, in Spain at least you have El Diario. How do I say it? El Diario.
El Diario.
El Diario. I can't pronounce it properly. I don't know what people think. I mean, they translate all my articles, so and but they seem to give I find them quite interesting because we don't have an equivalent of that in Britain. They do give space, don't they, to the left, and in a way that we don't really have in Britain at all. So I think that's an interesting model. My fear sometimes in Britain and elsewhere is there's an argument that we don't like the press, so let's use social media instead. Now, I'm a very strong supporter of social media and everything from Twitter to YouTube. I try to use that to reach as many people as I can. The danger is it becomes preaching to the converted, or an echo chamber, or whatever you want to call it, where people it was said in Britain at the last general election that if Twitter was representative, Labour would have won a majority of 150. And that's partly because, for one thing, the Conservatives only had a lead amongst people over the age of 44 at the last election. And people over the age of 44 are far less likely to use social media. So it becomes basically a comfort blanket for people rather than a means of reaching out to people. And that's also the danger with some news websites, whereby you get these dissident websites which are really only read by people who already agree with what they're saying. So for me, I would support definitely, because print media is in crisis in Britain, as here, print circulation is collapsing. And because of the internet, it is now easier to get, news outlets online that are accessible to millions of people. But it just has to be done in a way that doesn't end up just preaching to people who already agree. I know your relationship between the left and trade unions in Spain is different from our one. I would like trade unions in Britain, the ones led by the left, they're the ones who have millions of pounds and they could actually support the sorts of initiatives you're talking about. They do have the resources to do that. But as well as that, there is a rise now of self-funding where you get or crowdfunding for journalism. And people have started to do that for specific projects. They want to do projects which challenge authority to crowdfund the money to do it. And I think that's an interesting model, because one of the problems we also not have in Britain is not just ownership by media moguls, it's advertising. And there was a scandal involving the HSBC Bank last year and a half ago, and the Telegraph newspaper refused to report on it because of their advertising from HSBC. HSBC, they thought, would just end their advertising. So one of their main journalists resigned in disgust. It caused a big scandal at the time. He was a conservative commentator, but a man of decency. So crowdfunding, I think, is important too, because it can give editorial independence. So I think it's definitely an avenue worth pursuing, but I do have strong caveats, which is, at the same time, we do need to reach out to people who aren't politicised, who won't read a kind of radical website or what have you. And that means engaging with the mainstream media. It means appearing on television and arguing with people who are very unsympathetic to your ideas. I have to do that all the time in Britain. And it's not always fun. It's like swimming through vomit. It's probably a bit early to talk in such colourful terms, but it's not a fun experience. But it is necessary for people on the left to go on television and argue their case in a way that reaches people. Because often people on the left, they go on TV and get angry and do this with their fists, and it alienates people. So I do think we still need an intelligent engagement with the mainstream press, even though, yes, it's institutionally hostile to us.
Sí, a mí sobre esta cuestión me gustaría intervenir también. Ahora hay más palabras, ahora seguimos con el turno. Hola, ¿qué hay? ¿Qué tal? Porque en el fondo yo creo que hay un debate aquí un debate que yo creo que Owen plantea de forma muy correcta, que es el debate no solo en torno a lo que necesitamos, en torno al análisis que hacemos de la situación actual, sino el debate de la comunicación. Yo creo que las fuerzas progresistas, seguramente en Europa, seguramente desde luego en España, que es el caso que yo conozco, durante muchos años han estado recluidas en la verdad y en el análisis de que lo que necesitamos es esto, sin más. Y parece que con el mero hecho de formular las verdades y los análisis objetivos, simplemente, pues cae por su propio peso, se deriva por su propio peso la necesidad de una serie de políticas públicas que cambien la situación. Y yo creo que es profundamente incorrecto. Es decir, es estupendamente verdad y al mismo tiempo profundamente incorrecta esa estrategia, porque en ausencia de una propuesta que dispute el sentido común, que dispute el sentido de lo que la gente en su casa entiende como lo normal, lo estandarizado, lo lógico, buena parte de nuestra sociedad seguirá entendiendo que las desigualdades son una cosa, sí, muy injusta, pero que son lógicas, y que además se puede hacer poca cosa al respecto de vivir en sociedades muy desiguales o de vivir en sociedades en donde básicamente quien tiene mucho dinero no tiene por qué declarar, porque lo normal es llevárselo a un paraíso fiscal. Entonces yo creo que la disputa y la construcción de ese sentido común seguramente tenga que ser la agenda fundamental, la agenda política fundamental de las fuerzas progresistas. Un ejemplo tonto. entender lo que significa progreso o libertad durante mucho tiempo pasó por entender lo que sucedía con la jornada laboral. Entre 1880 y 1980 la jornada laboral en los países de la OCDE se redujo drásticamente, porque buena parte de las fuerzas, de los movimientos de masas, de los sindicatos o las fuerzas socialdemócratas, que básicamente agrupaban al grueso del movimiento obrero, entendían que la disputa de ese significado que tenía que ver con la libertad pasaba por una reducción continua y generalizada de la jornada laboral. Y esto era un elemento que era asumido de sentido común durante décadas para buena parte de los movimientos populares. Y esto significó una continua reducción de la jornada laboral, que es un elemento clave para entender la distribución de la renta, clave, durante un siglo. Y desde 1980 hasta aquí, prácticamente la jornada laboral ha permanecido estable en todos los países de la OCDE. Alguna excepción hay, Suecia, Francia en un momento puntual que después es revertida. ¿Por qué? Pues porque en buena medida las fuerzas progresistas, las organizaciones sindicales han renunciado a esta propuesta. No, es decir, uno mira los papeles y allí sigue la propuesta en los papeles y es muy bonita. Pero en realidad yo creo que a lo que se ha renunciado en buena medida es a diseñar una estrategia de comunicación que dispute el sentido común. Y desgraciadamente hoy el sentido común se disputa en un lugar muy desagradable, que son los platós de televisión, que es lo que entra en la casa de todo el mundo a las 11 de la noche. Entonces yo creo que eso que plantea Owen es seguramente una desgraciada verdad. La desgraciada verdad de que la disputa del sentido común hoy transcurre en lugares en donde la izquierda, en donde las fuerzas progresistas no han estado presentes durante las últimas décadas y por lo tanto creo que esto tiene que ver con los análisis que hacemos, creo que esto tiene que ver con las propuestas de políticas públicas que se hacen, el debate en torno a la desigualdad en este sentido es clave, pero creo que esto tiene que ver también con la disputa que hacemos del sentido común en una sociedad y esa disputa del sentido común tiene mucho que ver con las estrategias de comunicación. Había otra pregunta.
Bueno, pues lo primero agradecerle su intervención, ha sido realmente enriquecedora. Pero bueno, mi pregunta un poco va porque veo que aquí en el caso de España veo a parte de la izquierda lamentarse por la decisión del Reino Unido de separarse de la Unión Europea, ¿no? Y muchas veces veo que siempre acuden al argumento de que el movimiento del Brexit ha estado liderado por esta derecha xenófoba, que yo creo que es un hecho que es difícilmente cuestionable, que yo también comparto de alguna manera lo que estabas diciendo de que a lo mejor ha sido una parte de la izquierda que no ha sabido moverse en este ámbito y ha perdido la oportunidad de a lo mejor de liderar este movimiento, porque yo creo que existen motivos para una izquierda para defender una salida de la Unión Europea. Todos conocemos los males de estar en la Unión Europea, ¿no? Y cómo estos afectan especialmente a la clase obrera, a la clase trabajadora. Cómo desde Europa se mandan una lista de recortes y de ajustes que da la sensación de que aunque hayamos elegido un gobierno se van a aplicar igualmente, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que ahí existen ciertas pérdidas y ciertos motivos, ¿no? Y entonces yo me pregunto, ahora que ha salido esto, ¿es un buen posicionamiento lamentarlo o podría ser una oportunidad para darle fuerza a esa izquierda británica que sí que había peleado por un posicionamiento desde izquierdas, que muchas veces yo también veo que se ha visto tapado por los medios, a lo mejor interesados porque no se viera esa otra visión, solo se tomara la visión xenófoba del Brexit, ¿no? Y bueno, es un poco esto, ¿no? Es la opción correcta, se debería de haber posicionado intentando apoyar y recuperar ese espacio que ha perdido la izquierda en
Hola, buenos días. Bueno, lo primero, darte las gracias por estar aquí. Ah, vale.
It's not coming into the bit. It's not.
No coming?
She can't hear it. No.
Oh, ¿está funcionando el micrófono? Mira, a ver.
Hola, hola.
Ahora.
Bueno, lo primero, darte las gracias por estar aquí, por tu conferencia. Y nada, lo que te quería plantear es que desde el mundo académico muchas veces se ha planteado que las clases bajas son muy tradicionales, muy conservadoras, ¿vale? No sé si estás personalmente de acuerdo con esta premisa, pero suponiendo que sea, o sea, aceptando esta premisa como cierta, ¿cómo crees que sería posible que estas clases bajas comprendieran que los gobiernos conservadores no son los que más van a contribuir a transformar su situación, a reducir la desigualdad que les está afectando y demás?
Muchas gracias por la conferencia. Y mi pregunta tenía que ver con lo que hemos hablado del Brexit, de la inmigración y el aumento de la xenofobia. Y era cómo podemos...
Oh, it's not. Oh, she can't hear. She can't hear. Sorry.
¿Ahora?
Yeah. Is that okay?
¿Ahora bien? Mi pregunta tenía que ver con el aumento de la xenofobia respecto al Brexit y en toda la Unión Europea. Y es cómo podemos manejar o cómo podemos combatir desde partidos o desde movimientos de izquierdas a una Unión Europea. O sea, yo cuando pienso en Donald Tusk o en Juncker, que parecen más preocupados con partidos o con gobiernos como el de Tsipras en Grecia, de Syriza, o con Jeremy Corbyn, que parecen más preocupados con estos gobiernos de izquierdas que con gobiernos claramente de extrema derecha, como en Hungría de Viktor Orbán o como el actual gobierno polaco. Es decir, que parecen más preocupados con la izquierda que está surgiendo ahora que con la extrema derecha, que claramente ya gobierna en varios países, y que en algunos países como Francia, Marine Le Pen seguramente vaya a la segunda vuelta de las presidencias francesas y va a ir a más. Es decir, ¿cómo podemos combatir a este establishment que parece más preocupado por la centroizquierda o por la izquierda que por la extrema derecha? Gracias.
Bueno, es una pregunta sobre el Gran Londres, sobre las políticas contra la desigualdad del Gran Londres. En este mismo escenario de la Universidad Complutense trajimos en los 80 a Ken Livingstone, que hizo una política, entiendo yo, muy avanzada contra la desigualdad, apoyándose en asociaciones y movimientos populares. Sin embargo, la descentralización del Gran Londres, que promovió inicialmente la Thatcher, quebró aquella política. Y luego hay una evolución hasta estos momentos con un nuevo mayor, con un nuevo alcalde de Londres, que creo que retoma, no sé en qué grado, aquellas políticas. Me interesaría que tu opinión sobre las políticas contra la desigualdad que se están aplicando en Londres, aprovechando que también tenemos aquí a la alcaldesa ya para que recoja.
Well, thank you for those questions. Brilliant, very thoughtful questions. I'll take the European Union ones together. Well, look, there were actually people on the left who would have supported Brexit, but they realised that the referendum was not a referendum on the European Union. It was a referendum in any case about immigration. And I can't emphasise how poisonous the campaign was. It was portraying EU migrants as rapists, murderers, criminals, lied about Turkey joining the European Union and said we'd be flooded with Turkish criminals, whereby Nigel Farage stood in front of a poster which said breaking point, and the picture of it was of dark-skinned refugees, making it look like breaking point. It was a kind of inflammatory, frightening kind of poster and statement. It went on. It was a very, very disturbing campaign, and the consequences are obvious because, it's not true. 52% of people are not racist who voted for Leave. That's not true. But now, in Britain, racists and xenophobes think that 52% of people agree with them. They think they have a mandate. So hate attacks, hate crimes in Britain have spiralled. They've massively increased. The Polish centre in London has been graffitied with "Go home." People are being yelled at, "Go home, we voted you out," that kind of thing. And it includes people not just from Europe, people of Asian origin. It's a very frightening atmosphere. And there's a sense that xenophobia, they think, now has a mandate. So there are obviously criticisms, big criticisms of the European Union in its current form. Its lack of democracy, the fact that in places like Spain and in Greece and in Portugal, it has imposed policies that have been devastating for millions of people, not least younger people, whether it be the promotion of privatisation and things like the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. But I agree with the strategy of Yanis Varoufakis and others that we need to build movements across Europe to change the nature of the European Union. Because you know, I think Britain is an unjust, undemocratic state run in the interests of a tiny number of people. But I don't want to leave Britain. I want to change it. And I don't think it's naive to think it can be changed. I think it can. And we've seen with the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership that because people have organised and protested all over Europe, that treaty now could be lying in tatters. The French government are saying they're going to veto it, and that's only because people organised. So I think that does show it is possible to force change. I genuinely think Britain leaving the European Union is a disaster, the biggest disaster the country has faced since 1945. And everything from economic crisis, political crisis, the breakup of the country, xenophobia and racism, the rise of the conservative right, it's been disastrous. And those people on the left who supported Brexit, which was a very small number of people during that campaign, I mean, I just don't understand the lack of political judgment, because it was obvious what was going to happen. It would only ever be seen as a triumph for the populist and xenophobic right, and that's what's happened. And it shifted politics even more dramatically to the right in my country. So yes, the left will have to do its best now, but we're in a much weaker situation, a much more difficult situation than we were. And British society now is, in terms of the way it's divided, is in a very unhealthy way. Young versus old, working class versus middle class, not in a healthy way, in a kind of working class people thinking middle class people a bunch of liberal, cosmopolitan, metropolitan types, and middle class people thinking working class people are backward bigots. That's not a healthy division at all. Young people who, as I've said, think old people have ruined their lives. I mean, it's a terrible set of divisions, and black and minority ethnic people feel terrified in Britain at the moment. Many of them feel just scared about their future, as do people from Poland and Spain, for that matter. So, you know, yes, there's a critique to be made of the European Union, and we've got to change the European Union. I'm sad now we can't join that struggle in the way that I would have liked, though we will still be there in solidarity. But I think fight to change it, even though I know that's not easy. But I think the alternative is disastrous, particularly because if the European Union collapses now, when the populist xenophobic right is at its strongest since 1945, they will benefit. And we will return to the Europe of the 1930s. And we just can't allow that to happen. I mean, the point the other person made about the European Union, you're quite right. Do you remember when the Freedom Party joined the Austrian government in 1998 and the EU took action? Well, that whole strategy is now dead. And if we've seen now in Poland an authoritarian right-wing government, in Hungary an authoritarian right-wing government with an outright fascist party who gets 20% of the vote, and that party, of all the parties in Europe, is the one that looks most like one of the fascist parties from interwar Europe. And in Austria now it's likely the far right will win the presidency, and they'll win a big chunk of the parliamentary vote as well. The EU is not going to take any action against any of... Well, they haven't done. They've abandoned that approach. And we are seeing the rise of the hard right, the xenophobic right, and the far right, and they're being legitimised. And that's dangerous, because at the moment, in many countries, they are on the ascent. I'm afraid Brexit has given them a boost, undoubtedly. Marine Le Pen changed her Twitter profile picture to the Union Jack, the British flag, in celebration of Brexit. So that vote has clearly helped them. And we can't rely on the official EU institutions to take action against them. We've got to build movements across Europe ourselves to challenge them. It's the only way of driving them back. The point... this view of working class people being conservative. Well, I think this is very dangerous. There is a snobbery on the left. You've seen it in the United States for a long time. American liberals, I suppose, who regard, working class white Americans as being rednecks, trailer trash, backward bigots. And all they've done is drive them ever further into the arms of the populist right. It's their fault that working class Americans are voting against their own economic interests, because they haven't been inspired by a progressive movement that can win them over. And when we don't win over working class people, that's not their fault. That's the fault of That's the fault of progressive movements. There's nothing innately conservative about working class people. Working class people who, you know, in terms of the policies we're fighting for, in terms of workers' rights, higher wages, good public services, pensions, all of these things benefit working class people above all else. If we failed to develop a message that wins them over, that's our fault. You know, and I worry in Britain and in Spain and the United States, basically a progressive movement's becoming more and more middle class, and a view that, look how educated we are, and these people are just uneducated. They're stupid, and it's their fault. And that is a poisonous, lethal. It's wrong. It's not just wrong. It's politically poisonous. All it will do, the populist right will say, look at these elitist, middle-class leftists who only have contempt for people like you. Very, very dangerous. So I think we need to just basically challenge people who communicate like that, and do our best to win over working class people with a more inspiring message. We're getting the message wrong, but it's our fault, and we've got to resolve it. And finally, that point about London. Well, actually, the one good thing that's happened in Britain in the last few months, which there's not many you can say about that, was the victory of Sadiq Khan in London, because Zach Goldsmith ran, for the Conservative candidate, ran a poisonous campaign, an anti-Muslim bigoted campaign. Sadiq Khan is now the first Muslim mayor of any major city. He's someone who fought for LGBT rights, got death threats for it and all the rest, and who takes on anti-Semitism, who calls, you know, fundamentalist extremism a cancer, and yet his opponent portrayed him as the agent of Islamic fundamentalist extremists. And it was very, very dangerous indeed. It was a kind of anti-Muslim bigotry. It was the most, you know, racist campaign we've seen in Britain for a long time. And the fact he was defeated was absolutely critical. And Zach Goldsmith, the Conservative man, is a disgraced politician as a consequence. In terms of the policies, the problem in London is London has very few powers. They're basically at the moment limited powers over transport and housing. So, you know, there's going to be some form of freeze on fares, a limited freeze on transport fares. But also now, the problem with the policies of Boris Johnson, the former Conservative mayor, is obviously there was an emphasis on supporting property developers, and it meant building luxury flats and unaffordable housing. He redefined affordable housing so it became 80% of market rents. 80% of market rents in London is not affordable. In fact, in many parts you'd have to be, you know, in the top 5% by income to afford a so-called affordable home. So now the strategy is to change the definition of affordable and build a far higher percentage of it, and also to limit foreign owners who at the moment buy up huge amounts of new housing and then leave them empty. But it's still limited. He's got very limited powers, I think, compared to Madrid and Barcelona, though I don't know the exact powers. Manuela Carmina can describe in detail, obviously. But he's trying to tackle the housing crisis, because in London it's very, very acute. Hundreds of thousands of people who can't get affordable housing, a private rented sector where rents are soaring, and home ownership which is collapsing. But he can only do limited things. So one of the things he's campaigning for is to have more powers. And just finally, because that's me finished, it's just a final appeal. The problems that we face, the injustices that we face, we're not going to overcome them in our own countries. And they do differ, as I've said. They're not exactly the same. But despite Britain leaving the European Union, well, in the next few years in any case, and the fear, because I love my country, but I've never been so scared for it, and I'm afraid that goes for millions of people in Britain at the moment. But I'm absolutely determined that the injustices we face will be overcome, and they will only be overcome if we stand in solidarity with each other across borders. That's how we're going to get change. So we face difficult months ahead, both in Spain and in Britain, but our ancestors, as I've said, they overcame, they won, they succeeded, and we will as well.